Hello, welcome to Summerfest Online 2020. Thank you very much for coming along to view these presentations. Just a quick reminder that we have a number of exhibitors in the exhibitors hall. If you want to go along and have a quick browse, maybe do some shopping, then we'd love to see you. And a quick reminder too about our wonderful sponsors, Yayo Hemp Products and Butte Island Cheese. They're also in the exhibitors hall and they'd love to see you too. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember this is a free event, and if you'd like to make a small donation, you'd be very welcome. Please go to the Friends of VegFest page to make a donation. And a reminder too, we have another show in November, London Online, and in next March, Plant Powered Expo. And you can find out all about that on VegfestUK. Thanks very much and enjoy the presentation.
My name's Heather, I'm a dietitian and I've been working with the Vegan Society since 2016. I better clarify at this point that I've never specialised in paediatrics, but as you can imagine I get asked a lot of questions about childhood nutrition, so the aim of today really is to just provide a sort of brief overview of some of the things that I've learned about vegan nutrition for children of different ages whilst I've been doing this job. I'll just tell you a little bit about the charity before I get started. So we celebrated our 75th anniversary last year, so I feel really proud to work for the oldest vegan organisation in the world. Our founders coined the term veganism, and the Vegan Society was established back in 1944, so I think that's something that's useful to be aware of. We're a charity mainly geared towards helping people to go vegan and stay vegan, and obviously supporting vegan parents is part of that. So hope that you'll all be able to take away some useful pieces of information from today's session. PowerPoint isn't my favourite way of talking to people, so I'll try and make sure it isn't death by PowerPoint. Certainly the slides shouldn't take longer than about half an hour. And fingers crossed there'll be a bit of time for questions at the end, and I'll do my best to answer them. So if you do have any queries that you prefer to send me via email, you're welcome to use the email address on that slide, and I have a professional Twitter account as well, at Heather, so feel free to give that a follow. So hopefully by the end of this session you'll be able to understand how a well-planned vegan diet can provide the nutrients that are needed for growth and development during childhood, and also understand a few key considerations around nutrition for children of different ages, because of course nutritional needs do change a lot during our lifetimes, and particularly during childhood. So I just wanted to set the scene a little bit, sort of really paint a picture about why this is an important issue. So although we don't have a lot of data around vegan children, we do know that the amount of Brits who are eating a vegan diet has quadrupled since 2014. I'm one of those people who went vegan during that period, and it's now around 600,000, so that's a lot of people eating a vegan diet. And it does seem to be younger people who are driving the movement, so you can kind of extrapolate from that it's likely that there are a lot of people of childbearing age who are within that group, people who might be starting families or thinking about that. So obviously there are a lot of people out there who will be sort of considering how their lifestyle choices will affect the way that they raise their children. I think especially when you become a parent, you interact with a lot of different organisations, a lot of different services, and you may come into contact with people who don't necessarily understand veganism. So it's good to be aware of your rights, and if you haven't read about the exciting case that took place last month, that was a real landmark for veganism as a philosophical belief, then do check that out on our website. But basically, in a nutshell, veganism is protected by human rights and equality law. So it means that health professionals like me have a duty to respect vegan beliefs, and to do our best to avoid getting in the way of those beliefs. Obviously, the definition of veganism recognises that we avoid animal use as much as possible and practicable in a non-vegan world, and looking after your health is an extremely effective way of being a good advocate for veganism. So it's not always possible to avoid animal use, but we do our best, and that's what our lifestyle is all about. So I think it's really useful to be aware of our alliance with the British Dietetic Association. So they are my professional body, and we share this message together that you may have seen in the past. So basically, well-planned vegan diets can support healthy living in people of all ages. And there's a similar statement that's been put out by the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics as well. So I think it's a really important statement because it can be really useful in certain situations where maybe there's a lack of understanding about the potential of vegan nutrition to support life stages like growth and development. So I think before we sort of get stuck into the nutrition stuff, it is important to sort of take a step back and think of nutrition in a holistic way. So raising your kids vegan is a really compassionate way to bring them into this world. It helps you to nurture compassion every single day through the choices that you make, not just around food, but other lifestyle choices. It's really fun to explore how different foods grow. It's not maybe so fun to talk about animal farming. You have to be really careful about talking about that in an age-appropriate way, but with plants it's very different. For example, I didn't actually know until quite recently that pineapples grow this way up instead of, I thought they all sort of hung down like this. Maybe the rest of you in the room are experts on pineapple growing, but that was a pretty delightful fact for me to learn. So kids are probably going to be quite excited about understanding where fruit and vegetables come from and how they grow. So that's something nice that you can share with kids. Growing can be really satisfying, really rewarding as well. You don't necessarily have to have a garden. Lots of stuff grows well in containers. You can grow herbs on a windowsill, for example. There's also allotments, so growing projects out there. So that can be a really good way of getting out there and meeting people as well. And just making the whole process fun for kids as well. So something like food art with fruit and vegetables, making funny faces. There's lots of ways of making that experience of trying new foods really positive, and obviously that's something that all kids can enjoy whether they're vegan or not, but it's a really sort of positive way to start making connections with food and developing your relationship with food. So this is a vegan version of the UK's Eat Well guide. So in terms of kids, it starts to apply fully really from 5 years of age, so sort of around the time that kids might start school. Sort of between 2 and 5, you're kind of working towards a diet that's more similar to this. So this is really sort of family-friendly nutrition, and then younger children would need a diet that is a bit different from this because of their very specific nutritional needs at that time in their lives. So in terms of balancing food groups, this really applies to children from 5 and above. There's obviously the 5 a day thing in the UK, and sort of to put that into sort of child-friendly terms, it's sort of 5 portions of fruit and vegetables that sort of fit in that child's hand. So obviously adults would be going for like an 80-gram portion, but a child's smaller, so they don't need as big a portion. Whole grains are encouraged more from 5 years and onwards, but actually for younger children, as I'll talk about later, you might not always want to be pushing those whole grain choices. Protein's obviously really important nutrient for growth and development, and I'll talk a bit more about that particular nutrient as well. Nuts and seeds are such a core part of our diet as vegans, providing healthy fats and other important nutrients. And healthy dairy replacement is also really important as well, to make sure that you're getting enough calcium to help things like development of healthy teeth and healthy bones as well, and I'll touch a bit more on that. So I think it's really important to be aware that actually there's good quality plant protein in lots of groups of foods. So even around the Eat Well guide, there might be this sort of group that's dedicated towards protein-rich foods, but actually there's some overlap with different foods. So, for example, some starchy foods contain good quality protein, so quinoa, for example, buckwheat. So you can kind of get foods that tick a couple of different boxes, and that can be useful when you're trying to provide nourishing food for your family. Legumes are really superstars of vegan nutrition, so they're very affordable, good quality source of protein. There's lots of them that can grow in the UK, so they can be a really sustainable way of getting protein as well. A lot of people aren't aware that peanuts actually fall into the category of legumes as well, but they're higher fat foods, so they can provide a really sort of good dense source of nutrition. And soya products are really valuable as well. They provide high quality protein that's similar quality to meat and dairy, so they're definitely really valuable for people with relatively high protein needs. So that might be younger vegans, active vegans, as older vegans as well who need a bit of extra protein. So that's definitely a really valuable source. And certain nuts and seeds are good sources of protein. Not every nut and seed, it really just varies depending on which particular type you're talking about. And there are some meat alternatives out there, like corn, for example, is another source of high quality protein. You just have to be a little bit more mindful when you're using meat alternatives of what else is added to them. The salt limits for children are much lower than those for adults, so really it's better to try and choose the options that don't have added salt or lower salt options on a day-to-day basis, but they can contribute towards a balanced diet for sure, so those are potentially options as well. Iron's a really important topic, so iron deficiency is really common all over the world, no matter what your eating pattern may be, so it's really important for everyone to be aware of where iron comes from. So whatever way you choose to eat, you'll be getting a lot of your iron from plant foods, and potentially a lot of the reason why people don't get enough iron is because they're not aware of where the iron is coming from in these plant-based foods. A lot of the foods that are good for iron are also good for protein. You tend to find that protein, iron and zinc come in the same package, but there are some lower protein foods that provide useful amounts of iron as well. So, for example, something as simple as a portion of raisins or some dried apricots, some kale, certain green leafy vegetables are good sources of iron, wholemeal bread even, fortified breakfast cereal like wheat biscuits. So there are other sources of iron that aren't necessarily higher protein foods, but they do often come hand in hand. Another important aspect of iron status is iron absorption. So there are various ways to try and maximise it, and one of the best options is to make sure that your meals contain a good source of vitamin C. And if you reflect on what you're eating, you might find that you're doing this by accident anyway. So potentially if you're serving like a bean chili, for example, and you're including some pepper in it, and that would be combining a good source of iron with a good source of vitamin C, which will help to make sure that your body gets as much iron from that dish as possible. A lot of people ask me about iron supplementation, so routine iron supplementation isn't recommended for people who are vegan, and the reason for that is because vegan diets can support adequate iron status, but of course deficiency is a different matter. So if someone does have low iron status, that would need to be corrected with a supplement, and then obviously it would need to you'd need to have a look at the diet going forward to make sure that that was maintained in the longer term. But routinely I wouldn't recommend that people add iron to their diet using a supplement. So the short chain omega-3 fat called alpha-linolenic acid that you can get from certain seeds and walnuts, that's really important to include daily in a vegan diet. So it's best if you can to get it from whole food sources, because you're not only benefiting from the omega-3 fat, there's also the fibre that's in that food, a bit of protein potentially depending on which one you're going for. The seeds that are rich in omega-3 fat, like ground linseed for example, it's a good source of protein, iron and zinc, so mixing that into some soy yogurt or your porridge in the morning can give that a real nutritional boost. If you're in a situation where nuts and seeds aren't tolerated for some reason, if you want to add an oil, so a more refined version of that omega-3 fat, then linseed oil is a really good option because it's a very concentrated source. So you can add a small amount to food and mix that in and get the omega-3 fat in that way. And also routinely cooking with vegetable or rapeseed oil, and that can help to shift the balance of fats in your diet towards omega-3 fat. It's important to be aware that omega-3 fat and omega-6 fat compete. So if you eat a lot of huge quantities of pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds, use loads of corn or use loads of sunflower oil, you're shifting the balance more towards omega-6 fat. So it's good to be sort of aware of the different profiles of the fats that are in your diet and make sure that you're getting that good source of omega-3 fat into your daily diet. So I think it's really important to be aware of the best plant-based sources of calcium. And the way that I define that is that you get a good amount of calcium in a serving of food, and that calcium is well absorbed as well. And this is really where the fortified alternatives to dairy can play a really useful role. So if you take a glass of fortified plant milk and compare it to a glass of cow's milk, there isn't a difference in the amount of calcium that's in those two glasses. So it's a really useful way of people maintaining their calcium intake when they switch to a vegan diet. So if you don't use those products, it's really important to think carefully about where else you're getting calcium from. There are things like calcium set tofu, which is a really good source of calcium for people who enjoy eating something like that on a daily basis. Not all tofu is set using calcium, so you do have to check the list of ingredients. There's also certain types of bread, like soya and linseed bread, that's fortified with extra calcium, and you can figure that out by having a quick look at the nutrition table on the food label. So those types of foods will provide a really good amount of calcium in a relatively small serving. There are certain greens that are good for calcium, but you have to eat massive quantities of them to get the kind of amounts of well-absorbed calcium that you would from the foods that are provided as examples on this slide. And obviously for children, the amount of greens that they might be wanting to eat might be different to adults as well. So I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind. Particularly the fortified dairy alternatives are a really valuable source of calcium, and they're even mentioned in the UK's Eat Well Guide, recognised as a good source of that mineral. So I get asked about supplementation all the time. Not something that I really encountered before I did this job, I have to say. But there's sort of a few considerations around supplementation depending on the age of a child. So in the UK, there's a recommendation that all babies who are breastfed have vitamin D drops right from the beginning. At 6 months of age, for babies that are breastfed, and for any kids who are having less than 500 ml of infant formula. And there's also a recommendation to add in supplementation of vitamins A and C, which is basically a nutritional safety net in the UK, because it's recognised that unfortunately a lot of kids aren't getting enough of those vitamins in their diet. So that's sort of one of the general recommendations that exists up until 5 years of age. And then it's still recommended to use vitamin D supplementation at least part of the year. And there are a lot of groups who would be recommended to use vitamin D year round. So for example, someone who doesn't get out to have safe sun on a regular basis during the summer and the spring wouldn't necessarily be making enough vitamin D to support their vitamin D status. And some other groups as well, like those with darker skin, may need to think about year-round supplementation even past 5 years of age. So those are sort of the general recommendations to be aware of that apply to all kids in the UK. And then there are certain things that need to be considered from a vegan perspective. So in terms of the start of life, obviously breastfeeding nutrition needs to be optimised, and we have lots of advice about that, lots of guidance about that on our website. When you're introducing first foods, it's good to introduce some foods that are fortified with vitamin B12. So if you're breastfeeding, breast milk will be a source of B12, and there'll also be some B12 coming from food sources as well. Iodine supplementation, whilst breast milk's a significant source of iodine, of nutrition in general, iodine will also be provided by breast milk, assuming that breastfeeding nutrition has been optimised. But sort of around 1 year of age, it becomes particularly important to think about where iodine's coming from in a child's diet. And thankfully, there are more and more plant milks on the market now that are being fortified with iodine, and I'm sort of crossing my fingers that that becomes a more widely adopted approach. So that's potentially an option. And otherwise, another reliable option is to look into supplementation as well. The key thing about omega-3 fat is to get that food source into your daily diet, so that's the essential thing. We don't have a lot of research around supplementation of EPA and DHA from microalgae, which is a vegan source. There is some evidence that suggests that it raises the level of omega-3 fat in our blood, but we're not sure if that translates to health benefits. But it may be a particularly important consideration during periods of development, like pregnancy and breastfeeding and childhood, due to the role of those long-chain omega-3 fats in the development of our brain, our nerves, our eyes. So it's something to think about, but not considered to be an essential element of vegan nutrition. The essential thing is making sure that you're getting plenty of omega-3 fat on a daily basis. I'm just going to cover a few extra points about under 5 nutrition. I just firstly like to highlight a really great guide by First Steps Nutrition Trust. I've just copied in a page from it here. It's way more expert and extensive than I could ever hope to produce, because it's produced by people who are early years specialists. They're not vegan themselves, but they realised that this was an area where people wanted information, and there are loads of amazing recipes that can be used in like preschool and nurseries for kids under 5s that all the kids can enjoy. It's a really great resource, lots of information about nutrition, lots of really practical tips. So I really recommend checking that out in addition to the Vegan Society resources. As I mentioned earlier, iron's a really important nutrient to consider, and when kids start to try food for the first time, around that time, it's really important to make sure that some of the foods that they're trying are good sources of iron to support their iron status. So as I said earlier, a lot of those protein-rich foods are good sources of iron, so finding ways to help them enjoy beans, chickpeas, lentils and tofu, for example. Those foods are really valuable first foods. Also considering that up until sort of 5 years of age, obviously depends on the kid, but some kids do have quite small appetites, so more of the focus is about getting really dense food into their diet, so lots of nutrition in a small package. So it may be appropriate to use plenty of lower fibre sources of energy, like white rice, for example, and pasta, as well as maybe having some wholemeal bread, for example, in the diet, because that will help to make sure that they can get lots of nutrition in before their tummies get too full. So it is a bit of a different ball game to when you're sort of dealing with older children who might be able to cope with larger quantities of food. Also, in terms of getting lots of nutrition into a small package, something like quinoa can be quite useful because, as I said, it's ticking a couple of nutritional boxes. So it's not only a starchy food that provides energy, but it also provides some good quality protein as well. And it's really important to make sure that there's lots of energy in meals and snacks. So nuts and seeds can be really useful for that. Obviously, there can be a choking hazard for under 5, so it's really important to make sure they're offered in an appropriate form, whether that's ground up or as some kind of butter. Things like vegetable oil, olive oil, dairy-free spread can also be incorporated as well, just to make sure that those meals are really nutrient dense. So I really recommend having a look at First Steps Nutrition Trust guide for under fives for lots of really useful advice and lots of meal ideas, way better than I could ever come up with, and lots of lovely pictures as well. It's really nice. Aesthetically pleasing guide as well is really useful. I just wanted to give a special mention as well to teen nutrition. So if you look at different age groups in the UK, according to the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, we know that dietary quality amongst younger people is the lowest of any group in the population. Obviously there's lots of factors that contribute to that. But there's also really high nutritional needs in this group. So they're sort of, from a nutrition perspective, potentially quite vulnerable because they need a lot of nutrition, but they're not necessarily getting it. So I think it's really important to be aware of some of the sort of things, the special considerations around good fuel for teens. So one of the things is that calorie requirements are at a real peak for young people. So you can have a look, there's a good document by the British Nutrition Foundation that just sort of summarises the average calorie requirements of different ages, and they really peak massively for young people. So overall they're needing a lot of fuel. And the fuel that they're getting needs to be high quality as well. They need more calcium than adults. So those calcium-rich foods that I was talking about earlier, like calcium-fortified foods, calcium-set tofu, for example, they're playing even more important roles in helping them hit those higher targets. And also they need plenty of minerals like iron and zinc as well. So a lot of the time, as I said, you'll be getting those that from those protein-rich foods, but there are also lots of other foods that's important to incorporate throughout the day to make sure that you're hitting all those nutrient targets. So they're definitely a group that have very specific nutritional needs, and there's a guide on our website that's directed specifically to 11 to 18-year-olds. So that's something that's really useful to check out for anyone wanting to find out more. So just a few take-home messages. So basically, good nutritional planning is important for everyone. It's such an important part of giving your kids a great start in life, and that doesn't matter whether you're vegan or you choose to eat a different way. But it's about working out how to balance food groups, how to use fortified foods and supplementation wisely, and doing that in a way that's appropriate to that particular phase of growth and development. And the whole family can enjoy compassionate eating, and also the associated environmental benefits that might come with that, and the nutritional benefits as well of having your diet centred around a lot of minimally processed plant foods, helping you to get enough fibre and really set kids up for healthy habits for life, getting plenty of fibre, finding it easy to get their 5 a day, getting used to lots of different plant foods, a really varied diet, and just getting a lot of nutrition from those health promoting plant foods. If anyone does have any concerns about the diet side of things, I would recommend talking to your doctor about seeing a dietitian, maybe a paediatric dietitian if it's in relation to a child. If you do find that it's difficult to get a referral via the NHS, there are freelance dietitians as well out there, so it gives people a couple of options. I think that's particularly important if you feel like you just need to sit down with someone and have a talk about things and go through things in a bit more detail. Or maybe you've got concerns, or maybe you've got complex dietary needs that you're dealing with, particularly if there are other dietary needs on top of sort of trying to transition to a vegan diet. I think it's even more important that you have expert advice, and I think those are really good indications for a referral to a dietitian. As a sort of starting point, if you want to find out more, we've got a nutrition and health zone on our website, and we have guides for different stages of life. So there's a pregnancy and breastfeeding section for under 5, section for 5 to 10-year-olds, and a section for 11 to 18-year-olds, which is aimed at 11 to 18-year-olds. basically consisting of sort of some quick tips and then like an information sheet that you can open up as well. As I said, the First Steps Nutrition Trust Guide about eating well for vegan under 5s is really valuable, really comprehensive, really practical. We also have some tips about things like vegan rights under our Catering for Everyone campaign. So, for instance, if you're talking to a school and you're struggling a bit to sort of work out a good meal provision, for example, you might find that some of the information on our website gives you a good starting point for sort of communicating your rights as a vegan and communicating some of the benefits of all the children learning about veganism as a whole and embracing plant-based food. So some of that information might be really useful as well. And that brings me to the end of my slides. So I'm very happy to try my best to answer any questions. I think we've got maybe 10 minutes or so to do that.